depends upon, requires, assumes, presupposes. Those are common words. Of course, there are many more because the English language is vast, lots of synonyms, but those are some of the most common ones. Now, the approach, you may have heard about negating or denying the answer choices, which works. It's true. The correct answer choice, when negated, will destroy the argument, leaving no ambiguity at all. So we'll get into negation in a moment. That is the tactic. And it's an idea. You can do it mechanically, or you can simply ask yourself, which one of the following needs to be the case? If it weren't true, what would happen? So here's an example. Let's say this were an answer choice in a necessary assumption question. If we have the sentence, all people are standing, what would be the negation of that sentence? Now we have polar opposites versus logical opposites. And so when we're negating, we're looking for a very specific kind of opposite. Be careful about that. Polar opposite would be the other extreme versus the logical opposite, which is our actual negation. That's what we're looking to do. So very tricky, easy to make mistakes, but feel free to chime in over voice or in the chat. Love to get your thoughts.
So this is the distinction between wanting to say, okay, all people are sitting versus all people are not standing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it gets tricky though, because if you say all people are not standing, what exactly do you mean by that? Does that mean that nobody's standing? So we've got some comments in the chat here. Quinn is saying no one is standing. Nezreen is saying at least one person is not standing. Annie says not all people are standing. Nina says it is not the case that all people are standing. And Marcos says not all. So generally spot on. I would go with the not all as the simplest formulation of this. But I would say Nina is also saying it is not the case is a great way to negate. You just put the phrase in quotes, add it is not the case in front, and you've got your logical negation, your logical opposite. So polar opposite would be nobody is standing, whereas a logical opposite would be not all people are standing, or in other words, some people are not standing. So in this case, it could be the case that nobody is standing. It could be the case that everybody is sitting, but it doesn't require that everybody be sitting or that nobody be standing. A logical opposite simply means that at least some people are not standing. So I'd be careful about jumping to the opposite extreme there. A negation is simply a logical opposite. So all simply becomes not all. And if all is 100%, then not all would be 0 to 99.999%, anywhere within that entire range. So let's do another one. Some people are taking the LSAT today. Again, we have logical opposite versus polar opposite. So take a moment to give that one a shot, then we'll talk about it. So once again, we're focusing on that key quantity word some. If we have some people in the given, the logical opposite would be, as many are writing in the chat here, no one, nobody. So some means at least one. We're saying it's not at least one, meaning 0. So nice input there. I see tons of people in the chat. September, Nezreen, Marcos, Daniel, all saying no one. Exactly, perfect. So polar opposite would be some people aren't taking the LSAT today, which was actually possible in the original formulation, by the way, because some means at least one. It allowed the possibility that already not everybody was, meaning some people weren't. We want instead the logical opposite. Nobody is taking the LSAT today. So some becomes none, at least one, which is really 1 to all. Logical opposite is 0, what was left out of that range. Now, must be true versus necessary assumption questions. Most people don't tend to mix these up, but that's not why I'm putting them here. I'm putting them here because in my view, necessary assumption questions are really a very specific kind of must be true question. They're not always placed in the inference category. Some people categorize them differently, but I put them in that category because they're not really looking for new information. They're looking for something that is logically required in order for the argument to work. meaning that someone who already believes in the stimulus, if we take the stimulus as given, the necessary assumption is an underlying requirement. It's implicit, so it actually could be viewed as an inference. This is not a tactical thing, it's more of a theoretical or conceptual thing, but I still think it's important to get down. But as for the difference, though, must be true questions are often looking for you to connect different parts of the stimulus, might be looking for you to paraphrase, and of course, they are not always arguments. They could simply be fact sets. In contrast, necessary assumption questions are, again, asking for something that's typically unstated, not stated directly in the stimulus outright, but is, of course, required for the argument to work. And these are more often going to be informal logic. In fact, I always view these as being informal logic, meaning we're not diagramming here. Never diagramming necessary assumption questions. In contrast, sufficient assumption questions, I would sometimes diagram, and I would typically think that they could be diagrammed even if it's not always useful to do so. But for necessary assumption questions, I would actually never diagram these. I would just look to take it in a real world sense and ask myself as I go through the choices, does this need to be true? If it weren't true, what would happen? Again, correct choice when negated destroys the argument. Now, negating. We did some simple negations with simple sentences. Some people are taking the LSAT and all people are standing, but conditional statements, negating those is a bit trickier. And so I've put together here some slides about that. So negating a conditional, if your conditional was X requires Y, some incorrect ways you might go about negating it: negating the sufficient condition only, negating the necessary condition, negating both the necessary and the sufficient, or simply taking the counterpositive. None of those is the right way to negate a conditional statement. You never want to go about it that way. Instead, what you want to do is you want to negate the arrow itself. So if you have the arrow there, put a slash through the arrow instead. I've talked about this in some other contexts fairly recently, but I know it's a confusing topic and maybe not everybody got it down, so I thought it was worth including again. But again, if we say X requires Y, the negation would be negating that verb itself. So the verb requires, right there, that becomes does not require. So that's what the key part of this that you're actually negating, that you're actually changing positive requires to negative does not require. So slash through the arrow, that's how you want to go about it. There are many answer choices in necessary assumption questions that have conditional framing. I don't want you to typically take too mechanical an approach with it, but that is how you would do it if you needed to. And feel free to ask any questions about that. I know it's a confusing topic. Now I've got an example here about this. If I have pizza, then I'll be happy. P requires H. Negating that, again, we're negating the conditional nature of that relationship. We're negating the arrow itself as a way to negate the entire idea or the entire sentence. So again, slash through the arrow, that's how you'd go about it. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.